Today on the Perception and Action podcast, does thinking about movement always hinder performance? If so, is the solution to stop thinking and rely solely on automatic processes? Or is it possible to reach a state where consciousness remains on the surface, but our body leads the way? So it's time for a call to action. Hi, this is Rob Gray from Arizona State University. I've been on a now over 25-year journey as a researcher, professor, and high-performance consultant to understand how we acquire and adapt our perceptual motor skills. Welcome to the Perception and Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. Before we get to today's topic, I want to tell you about a couple extra things that might interest you if you're enjoying the podcast. First, my book, How We Learn to Move, A Revolution in the Way We Coach and Practice Sports Skills, is now available in audiobook format. You can find it on Audible or Amazon. Second, if you're interested in working directly with me, I currently have openings in my monthly mentorship program. This includes monthly Zoom meetings, either one-on-one or with your staff, analysis of your practice designs, and a monthly group discussion with coaches and instructors from a range of different sports. To find out more, please go to patreon.com/perceptionaction. Now on to the show. In today's episode, I want to look at an interesting new paper from Anna Fulce, looking at the topic of paying attention to our movements. In the skill acquisition field, we have a pretty strong opinion about this, don't we? Focusing your attention on your movement is bad. We have the large body of work showing the inferiority of an eternal focus of attention, work showing that attending to movement is what seems to cause choking under pressure, and traditional models of skill acquisition where the goal is to reach a state of automaticity, where you're not attending to your movements at all. We need to go from being mindful of our movements, that is trying to control everything, to being mindless, letting our body just do it on its own. So for God's sakes, don't think about what your body is doing when you're executing your skill. But is this really correct? This is something I've been thinking a lot about in terms of the ecological approach. If we're going to abandon the idea of automaticity as it's defined in the information processing approach, see episode 326, are we just replacing it with self-organization? Is self-organization mindless in that we must get our attention away from the body to let it happen? I don't think so. In the ecological approach, we emphasize establishing a functional and adaptable relationship with one's environment. As Tim Ingold so wonderfully put it, learning is about attending to things rather than acquiring the knowledge that absolves us the need to do so. This doesn't sound very mindless and automatic to me. Do we need to think of attention in a completely different way in the ecological approach? I think we want to capture some of the same ideas meant with concepts like automaticity and proceduralized knowledge, but in a very different way. This is something I touched on back in episode 359 when looking at the concept of being minded. That is, sitting somewhere in between complete control of our movement and complete automaticity. I think this article by Fulce expands nicely on this line of thought, so let's have a look. In her paper, Fulce lays out two questions. 1. Is there an inherent conflict between skilled action and at least more than a marginal awareness of that action? Or is it possible and even desirable to reflect on our own performance without considerably impeding on it? 2. What forms of consciousness pertaining to the body and action must we distinguish in order to answer the first question? She begins by reviewing the different alternatives that have been proposed. The idea of automaticity or mindlessness in the control of movement is captured nicely in Dreyfus's concept of absorbed skillful coping, a level of skill where our actions are wholly intuitive and no deliberation occurs. Quote, there are various forms of cognitive relations, calculation, deliberation, reflection, monitoring, etc. to our actions before the highest level is attained. At the expertise level, however, we are non-minded or mindless, absorbed in what we're doing, intuitively responding to the solicitations the situation affords us. On the lower levels, then, there are still details that the non-expert needs to consciously focus on. The performance is perhaps fluid in certain respects and in determined situations where the challenge is less important, as when the advanced beginner is driving on a road with little traffic or on a sunny summer day. At higher levels of skill acquisition, the performer relies less on conscious calculation and more on intuition. It is only when this absorbed, skillful coping is for some reason interrupted that an expert starts to pay attention. Or conversely, paying attention makes things go wrong even for an expert. End quote. Note, some of the language in there sounds an awful lot like what we might say from an ecological approach. Quote unquote, the actor is intuitively responding to solicitations the situation affords us, aka they're picking up affordances from the environment. But is that being mindless? Mindless is really being defined here as the absence of indirect perception, computation, processing. So in that sense, yes, it is. If you believe perception is direct, these things are not going on. But I don't think that means we can extend this to all types of consciousness, awareness, and attention. To say there is not indirect processes involved in the control of action is not saying that they're completely unconscious. It's just a completely different conception of cognition and attention. But we'll get to that. Back to the paper. The idea that the control of action is completely automatic and mindless has been challenged even from within the information processing view. Fulci next assesses the work of Barbara Montero, who promotes a stronger role for cognition and attention in the control of action. Specifically, Montero argues that while automaticity might work for rote, everyday actions and low levels of skill, to be an elite performer requires disrupting this, breaking into skill with conscious focus and attention so that we can reach higher levels of performance. Quote, Montero stresses that what characterizes expertise is not primarily the performance at this level happens on its own, but that it involves the aim to constantly push beyond one's limits. Many times this means focusing on and struggling with one's own automatized behaviors or habits. Montero contends that automaticity is needed when things go wrong, not when they go right. End quote. Again, there's a hint of the ecological approach here, because I think what Montero is really talking about here is adaptability or dexterity. We can't just be mindless or automatic at elite levels because the constraints are always changing. So she is identifying the same problem Bernstein did, but solving it in a very different way. To quote the paper, Montero overemphasizes top-down cognitive processes such as thinking, reflecting, monitoring, deliberating, analyzing. At the same time, experiences that are widely shared by expert performers, such as letting the body take over or being fully absorbed in the performance, are not really allowed for. Montero's general picture of the expert mind here remains one of control, analysis, and intentionality, keeping a phrase or keyword in focus. End quote. So we don't want to be completely mindless because it doesn't allow for intelligence and adaptability in our movements. But we don't want to have to solve this problem by having to introduce temporary mindfulness, where a central executive takes control over our movements. So what is there to do? For me, the problem we're having here is a direct result of taking an asymmetric view of the control of action. When we talk about our attentional focus, we often presented it as two binary options, attending to our body or attending to the environment. We're breaking the athlete-environment relationship apart. What if we took a more symmetrical view and introduced the possibility that we can attend to both skill execution and our environment at the same time? As Fulci notes, these approaches do not leave much room for cognitive processes that are one with the body. Not cognition as directed to action, but cognition within and through embodied performance itself. To elaborate on these ideas, she discusses some of the wonderful work by Merleau-Ponty. Quote, for the player in action, the football field is not an object. That is, a something in our environment that remains equivalent under its apparent transformations. It is pervaded with lines of force, the yard lines, those which demarcate the penalty area, and articulated in sectors, for example, the openings between adversaries, which call for a certain mode of action and which initiate and guide the action as if the player were unaware of it. The field itself is not given to him, but present at an imminent term of his practical intentions. The player becomes one with it and feels the direction of the goal, for example, just as immediately as the vertical and horizontal planes of his own body. Each maneuver undertaken by the player modifies the character of the field and establishes in it new lines of force in which the action in turn unfolds and is accomplished, again altering the phenomenal field. End quote. So in other words, the player is not attending to the field or their body, they are attending to the relationship between the two. Not what the environment is, the physical layout of the lines and the markers, but what it affords to them, the forces, the openings. As Fulce notes, quote, on Merleau-Ponty's account, our consciousness is embodied and intertwined with the environment, here the football field, letting the body find its way. Skills, expertise, and bodily reflection allowance for embodied subjectivity, and consciousness is immersed in the relationship between the environment and action. And quote, Merleau-Ponty does not claim that this happens unconsciously, but here, as in other texts, he points to the state of mind in between the theoretical observing relationship and the mechanical automatic non-minded one, where there are practical intentions, motor significations that impel us to recast our notion of consciousness. It is a bodily form of intellection rather than conscious thought directed to bodily action. Another interesting body of work discussed in the paper is that of Lanegan. He proposes a distinction between what he calls an opaque and a transparent body. An opaque body is one in which we control our interaction with the environment by focusing on the control of our limbs rather than quote-unquote seeing the environment directly. This in many ways is consistent with a lot of information processing ideas, for example, predictive processing theory. In predictive processing, we have no direct access to the world, only the sensory feedback we receive from our actions in it, and the predictions about what that feedback should be. The alternative, the transparent body, is one in which we look through our body to the world. That is, we perceive the world in terms of how we can act on it. To relate this to Fulce's two questions posed at the start of the paper, she notes, quote, a performer scrutinizes her body, her movements and her performance, an opaque body, but she is also aware in a more embodied way of her performance while acting, a transparent body. I assume both Lanegan and Monteiro would agree that scrutinizing reflection can hinder optimal performance if it's misdirected. But what about this embodied reflection? Can it impede skilled action? She continues, quote, with bodily reflection in a more radical sense, it is the body itself that takes the lead. Not a mindless body, of course. It is not a question of pure automaticity, but of letting the limbs with their experience take over and produce the gaze. It is a state where the mind is open and available, where consciousness remains on the surface of movement, letting the hand or the body explore its inherent possibilities. Here it is the body is active. A reflection is a bodily matter based on the acquired skill and experience of the performer, with the mind open on the experience without trying to take hold of this experience, end quote. Finally, she concludes, quote, the solution is not to stop thinking and relying on automatic processes. As we have seen, various forms of attention are needed at all stages of skilled performance, and performers often aim to resist strongly habitualized patterns. While consciousness in skilled action can be both pre-reflective and reflective, many expert performers describe strategies for finding a state of mind where the body leads the exploration, and consciousness remains, as it were, on the surface, what I have called bodily reflection, end quote. So in sum, I agree with Fulce that we need to take a broader view of what it means to pay attention to our movement. By taking a more symmetrical view in which we don't think about attending to your body or attending to your environment, but rather are thinking about attending to the relationship between them. This is an error people often make when first coming to the focus of attention literature. They assume that internal means body and external means outside world. But if you look more carefully at Gabby's definition, and at the conditions that actually produce the best outcomes for an external focus, it's not just the outside world. It's the effect your movement has on the outside world. In other words, a relationship. Okay, that's it for today's episode. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter at ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including written transcripts, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep them coupled.